If anyone is overly familiar with OpenChain, I do beg your pardon. As I said, I'm assuming that a lot of the audience watching live and watching on the recording will not be familiar. So we're going to have a whistle-stop tour of the OpenChain project, why it's there, how it works, and then we'll open up for questions so everyone can jump in and clarify points where they'd like to learn more. So the big picture is that we're talking about the software supply chain here. And the mental model people tend to have of the software supply chain is something working neatly and tidily, where the reality is, of course, that the software supply chain is a chaotic mess. Always has been and probably always will be. Specifically from our optic, and we're thinking about matters like open source compliance, the chaotic mess is significant in terms of the impact on licensing and security. In most industry verticals, 100% of code bases are using open source. In the industry verticals with the least usage, data from Synopsys shows that it's 93% or more of code bases contain open source. And in these code bases, 53% have license compliance issues and 81% have security issues. That gives you some idea of the scale of the challenge that we face with open source software. And I should put a preface here that this type of issue, this type of complexity, this type of challenge is not inherent to open source. It's the same for all different types of software. It's just our topic today is open source, and here are the numbers for open source. To deal with these type of challenges, a bunch of companies came together. These companies represent around $6 trillion in market value. And they had the insight that to address the type of challenges they were seeing on the compliance front, like licensing being over half of code bases and security being over 80%, none of these companies were big enough to address it alone. The solution would have to be doing something together. The solution that they decided to pursue was a relatively simple one. To make the supply chain trusted, the group of companies would align industry around standard approaches to process management. By having standard approaches to containing license compliance, containing security challenges, we'd reduce risk, cost, and increase speed. The start was open source license compliance. We began the project in 2016, and that was the largest fire to put out in those days. And of course, the mechanism to do so was something that we put a lot of thought into. We decided to work on normalizing the idea of a standard approach. In other words, building a community. And then embedding the standard approach through mechanisms such as procurement. And to accomplish this, the project did various things. It built standards, it built that community, and it built reference material to push industries into a direction of having a harmonized approach to managing open source. Now, the community that we built was significant and continues to be. It's continually growing. The idea was that if we were to harmonize with some standardization around license compliance and later security, we'd want to have specification work groups, which would be international and allow everyone to participate. We need to have reference material, so we need an education work group. We need to allow people space to discuss matters of interest to them. So, for example, tooling, export control, and public policy, or industry-specific, like automotive and telecommunications. Perhaps most importantly, if it's going to be a global effort, it's going to have to operate in multiple languages. And to that end, we established regional user groups in multiple countries, multiple regions, multiple areas. Particularly notable, I think, would be the CJK locations of China, Japan, and Korea, where people would be able to communicate on matters related to open source, license compliance, security, other business process management in their own language. The OpenChain community today, in terms of active members of our mailing lists, people who turn up on calls, WeChat in China, and so on, is over 1,000 companies working on this idea of how do we build a better supply chain for open source software. This scattershot of logos is intended to give you a taste of some of the companies that are in the community itself. Now, this is separate from the member companies that founded the project and continue to support it financially. These are companies that are part of the mailing lists, part of the meetings, part of the discussion. Lockheed Martin is center on this slide because currently they're co-chairing our spec development, and as a pure community member, the representative there, Chris Wood, has been a contributor for a while and was voted in, and continues to do great work. Actually, it was their expertise which helped us take our original license compliance spec, note that the market was using it for security purposes, fork it, create a sister standard, and then take that sister standard through ISO and create the security specification that I'll bring up again later. Now, OpenChain touches a lot of industry verticals. This slide, again, like the last one, is intended to give you a taste of the type of companies in the ecosystem. The focus here is on companies that are either board members of the OpenChain project or have announced conformance and are pretty large. The industry verticals we touch tends to be based on just demand pull. People are working out how to address things like open source license compliance or open source security. They tend to look for a harmonized solution. ISO standards, which we build, are a good way to do that. And then as they adopt them, they push it through the supply chain, and their suppliers gradually align as well. Now, the standards we're best known for, and the primary activity of our project, is related to ISO 5230 and ISO 18974. 5230 is the international standard for open source license compliance. That's related to managing open source processes on a program basis inside a company. And then as the companies link up in the supply chain, it makes things more reliable. Very similar, given that it's a sister standard, is the ISO standard for open source security assurance, ISO 18974. Both of these are high-level process standards. The idea is to have them as simple as possible in a manner that allows them to be used by companies of all sizes in all markets. And we openly develop them. We have everything now published through GitHub and calls that everyone can join. Now, I mentioned that we are looking at process standards that work in programs company by company. Here's more precisely how it works. These process standards define some inbound process points that a company program would want to address something like license compliance or security assurance. They identify internal training policy and process points that are important to fill out, and they identify some outbound process points that a company should fill out in a relevant compliance program. The standards identify the process points, but are non-prescriptive in the process content. In other words, they say, for example, train people. They don't say how to train people. And that's purposeful. We want to make sure that these standards are usable by different markets, different company sizes, different implementation requirements. Anyway, once a company has a program in place and its suppliers have a program in place, you begin to see a more predictable supply chain, less errors, and where remediation is required, it's faster and more efficient. Now, the ISO standards we maintain are supported substantially in terms of adoption. We wanted to make sure that companies could get hold of these standards and use them as easily as possible. We support self-certification, independent assessment, and third-party certification. This means that a company can pick up the standards. They can either get them off the ISO website in the main web store. It's about, I think, 90 Swiss francs for each standard. In the ISO Pass repository, where it's free, or get it from our website, where it's free as well. and, for instance, grab self-certification material and off they go. The self-certification material is pretty simple and yet quite useful. Instead of having to interpret one of the standards that you pick up, there are checklists, and you can use these checklists for conformance purposes to actually adopt the standards, or you can use them, as many do, as a health check for the org. So we see these checklists going into the hands of companies which are not yet preparing to use our ISO standards, but find them useful to see where future investment in compliance processes may be beneficial as a litmus test of how to align with industry understandings of what's a quality license compliance or security assurance program. Now, I should emphasize here that the OpenChain project in making this type of material available is naturally self-interested. Once people start using our checklists, they're more likely to start using our standards. When it comes to using the standards, there's quite a lot of market traction, and I wanted to highlight 5230 here. ISO 5230 has been in market for a while. It's entering its 4th year as an ISO standard, and prior to that it was out for around 4 years as a de facto standard. Now, since the ISO standard was published, analysis by Synopsys on compliance issues in open source show a 12% decrease in compliance issues related to code bases and the supply chain. We can't take all the credit for that, but we can say that we're having a contributory effect to making the supply chain work better, particularly when you think about the type of scale we're seeing in adoption. So for example, 31% of large German companies, that's companies with over 2,000 employees, are using or planning to use ISO 5230 based on research sponsored by PwC Deutschland. On the security side, it's a much newer standard. ISO 18974 is from December 2023, so it's just getting started. It's available in the ISO web store and on our website, and naturally it has plenty of resources for things like self-certification. We've seen a bunch of companies announce adoption of the security standard. Particularly notable, I think, would probably be Kakao Bank over in Korea and LG. One, of course, is a bank. The other is LG Electronics, which makes all those fantastic televisions we love. And BlackBerry in Canada, which, of course, is very much concerned with enterprise security matters these days. Now, tying it all together, I wanted to give you some perspective of where it's all going, what it means, what type of impact it has. We see a regular cadence of companies announcing their adoption of the OpenChain standards. For example, just around a week ago, we had Volvo announce a 5230 conformant program. In the case of Volvo, in the automotive sector, they join a raft of companies like Toyota and Kia, Hyundai, and many more, using these ISO standards to align their suppliers on consistent, reliable ways to manage risk containment around open source. We support all of this activity with a huge amount of reference material. I mentioned we're not prescriptive about how the process points are implemented, but we're not negligent in providing plenty of examples. So our existing reference library has training material, policy template material, supplier education, those self-certification checklists I mentioned, and so many more documents. On our GitHub, there's somewhere in the region of 1,000 documents at the moment. We try to make it as navigatable as possible, and we do try to be responsive to questions and feedback, particularly when people say, in my industry sector, something is confusing, can you help? The type of use of our reference material has been very heartening. So for example, when we released a free online training course with Linux Foundation training a year or two ago, we very quickly found that Continental, Bosch, and KPMG were making it mandatory for their internal software staff to do that course and recommending it to suppliers. which was both surprising and heartening to see such very quick traction of an ancillary reference material. But I think also indicative of the fact that we're producing material in service of our standards, but what the standards are doing and what that material is doing is helping with a very common, very easily understood, and fundamentally easily managed problem domain of open source license compliance or open source security. Providing solutions on that hit a chord. Now, we've done a ton of webinars. When COVID hit, we decided to get started on a webinar series to help bring people together. And since April 2020, we've published more than 80 webinars covering everything. Our own standards, things like how OSI define open source, deep dives into automation and tooling options, particularly open source automation and tooling, unpacking SBOMs, AI compliance, and so on. And things don't stand still. As it happens, we have Andrew on this call, which is nice because he's the chair of education. The reference material that he and his team are working on is extensive. We have updated training slides, supplier education material, a new SBOM quality guide, explainers for different business roles, and one thing I'm very excited about, maturity modeling. I think I should say at this point, Andrew's got a call in about an hour and a half, I think, so if people want to learn more specifics about this, they should join his call. QR code will take you in that direction. Now, something like the OpenChain project is user companies helping user companies by and large, but we've also fostered an extensive commercial support ecosystem. So we have official partners, and those are companies that know our project, work with us, and understand our goals very clearly. We've got third-party certifiers, 15 of them providing global coverage several times over. Most of the major tooling or automation companies, a bunch of legal providers and consultancies, all on standby to assist people who want external support and help around the standards that we build. Now, we do try to support the continued evolution of open source professionalization. As you'll have gathered, what we do is relatively dry. It's business process management for dealing with open source risk. And we like this. We like the idea of making open source normalized so that it's predictable and so that more and more companies will participate and increase the value of the shared platforms. Open source itself is evolving. It started off as a pretty exciting and ad hoc field. Now it remains exciting in terms of technology, but the ad hoc part is petering out. And not for a bad reason. Open source is becoming more professional, it's becoming more accountable, it's becoming more sustainable. We think that open source is trending towards more traditional software asset management. As we've formalized the knowledge about this area of software, it becomes far more easy for companies anywhere to manage it, and that's good. Now, our current standards for licensing and security will help with dealing with open source in alignment with software asset management approaches to other types of software. But we're also looking ahead, and we're looking ahead to how the market will change in the future. Because we're an open project and we openly develop things, we're allowing everyone to be part of discussing the next generation for licensing and security management in open source. People can turn up and contribute on GitHub, on our calls, on our mailing lists, and help us ensure that when it is required to update these standards, the updates will include all of the adjustments, refinements, and market needs that emerge. Now, I said everyone can contribute, and that's very, very literal. People don't have to be a member of the project, they don't have to be part of the Linux Foundation, they don't have to have standards experience or have spent time entering our project and socializing previously. People can just go to GitHub, have a look at the issues, and open a new one. we keep the barrier to entry as close to zero as possible. The monthly calls are probably a great way for you to be part of this. And as I mentioned, current chair around spec is Chris Wood over at Lockheed Martin, and the work group for specification meets once for North America and Europe per month, once for North America and Asia per month. The only thing you have to do to be part of that work group, whether in an ad hoc or an ongoing basis, is turn up. Now, we don't want to stand still. We also want to support aspects of the market future which go beyond, let's say, traditional areas of open source, new areas of open collaboration and governance. And I wanted to flag, because it's on everyone's radar these days, that we are looking at AI compliance matters for the supply chain. So since this January, after some initial preparation last year, we launched an AI compliance study group. They have been taking a measured, careful look at the supply chain and considering how compliance can work in a non-normative fashion. If we're dealing with a supply chain, we're dealing with compliance packages, it could be models or data sets or something else, moving through the supply chain. What are the type of minimum processes we need to manage that on a program-by-program basis in a manner that would allow a trusted supply chain to emerge? And this discussion is beginning to whittle down the kind of key commonalities that there might be. If they find enough commonalities that appear to be true enough to maintain over time, the study group could convert into a work group to specifically work on guides or other material about AI compliance in the supply chain. It's a good place to go if you want to talk about this. And naturally it aligns with a lot of the other activities happening out there. For instance, the model openness framework over at LFAI on data. It's talking about how open various AI things are. That aligns with our discussion. It's an adjacent, a separate discussion, but there's no contradiction in that, and it's all part of a toolkit for thinking about how do I deal with this problem domain in my supply chain in a manner that allows me to do my business stuff with as little complication as possible. Anyway, OpenChain is a pretty big project, and it's a huge community. And we do have a lot of commercial support for those parties who need it. Though I would put the proviso here that we really are user companies for user companies, and we do try to make sure that anyone can be part of this. They can use the standards, they can get tons of reference material without requiring an outlay beyond their internal time and transition management. For those of you who are new, we'd love to have you as part of this. You can go to the participate page and see all of our forthcoming calls, see all of our mailing lists, our Slack, our WeChat in China, and other ways of interacting and communicating with us. And that's it for the slides. I'm happy to roll on to questions now as useful. Oh gosh, lots of chat going on there. Brittany escaping.
Great stuff, Shane. That was really good. Thanks for that. Does anyone want to kick us off with some questions for Shane? Well, I mean, I've got a couple of questions off my own back. So Shane, our group is, quite sort of focused on the OSPO and people working in open source program offices, compliance, that kind of thing. What would be your advice to getting started? First of all, would it be taking the training courses or turning up to the meetings, or what do you recommend?
I think for OSPOs, the best way to get started would be just grab these self-certification checklists. And this is quite apart from deciding I'm going to use these standards. These self-certification checklists distill the core of the standards into a series of bullet points. And bear in mind that the standards distill 30 years of experience from hundreds of companies onto how to manage, let's say, open source compliance. So if you grab those checklists, you have a very quick way of doing a health check. What are we covering? Have we missed anything? And if we are covering something here, and it aligns with the standard, what might there be to improve what we're doing? So yeah, the checklists would be where I'd say start. The fact that there's a lot of other material is great, and if you happen to need to make an open source policy, yes, we've got a policy template. You can take it at CC0. We have training slides, CC0, just take and go. So you can raid our GitHub repo for reference material and scoop up whatever you want. In this case, it really depends on the sophistication of the OSPO. If you know what you're hunting for, good luck. There's 1,000 documents, you'll find it. If you have no idea what you're doing, go to the checklist first, because 1,000 documents will not help you. You will freak out.
Nice, that's a good starting point. And I guess the second question was, obviously you showed lots of logos and things on the screen there. And this is more of a question for like people like Peter and Mimi and Katrina on the call. But have you guys come across these standards already in your firms? Are you looking at them? Do you want to have a crack at that, Peter or Katrina or Mimi?
So there's a question from Nita in the chat.
Yeah, okay. Peter, did you hear what I was saying there?
Yeah, no, I was hoping Mimi is going to answer.
Should we jump to Nita's question first then, even though she's there?
I didn't actually understand what you had asked.
Okay, so I was asking, so from your perspective at Morgan Stanley, have you looked at these standards? Are you thinking about employing them? Or what's your position on them?
I personally haven't looked at them. I can't really speak to the OpenChain, what we covered in OpenChain right now. Is that what you're talking about? Or are you talking about SBOM and et cetera?
I was specifically talking about any of them. Let's not narrow it down.
Yeah, we've been working on SBOM implementations internally, but we've moved towards the Cyclone DX space as opposed to the SPDX space. But yeah, we have looked into that. I'm curious about VEX reporting, but yeah, I don't know that I'm in the best place to discuss it right now. It's like a little all over the place, sorry.
Sure. No worries, Mimi.
It touches on an interesting point. There's a few SBOM formats out there. I believe that Alan Friedman, when he was at NTIA and continues at CISA, talked about 3, right? So we had SPDX, SWID, and Cyclone. And different companies are falling in different areas with the SBOM formats they're picking up. And some companies are taking an SBOM format like Cyclone and modifying it. So Siemens has the Siemens SBOM, which is a modification of Cyclone DX. Toyota has SPDX plus T, which is an enhancement of SPDX for their particular requirements. When it comes to that type of, question of how do we deal with all the different SBOMs, something like the OpenChain standards are agnostic. Since we came to market in 2016, we said have an SBOM, but we've never specified a format. Naturally, a bunch of our reference material does tend to include information about SPDX. It's a sister project at LF. But we've tried to make sure that everyone understands clearly that as a high-level business process standard, we're setting the context for how to run a program. And then implementation details like what's the format of my SBOM or what type of automation do I use are at a level below. What is something to note, though, about the SBOM formats is that there are more and more translation tools between them. And when we started working on the SBOM quality guide, which came out of our telco work group, they increasingly found the potential for defining quality SBOMs and it being format agnostic. The first generation of the guide is focused on SPDX because that's where the telco companies like Ericsson, Nokia were focused. But as they prepare generation 2, they're looking at, I believe, transparent compatibility in terms of, I want a quality SBOM. Is what the supplier offering me a quality SBOM? And that to be answerable whether the supplier is throwing SPDX or Cyclone at you. So yeah, we're noodling through these challenges and working out how to make sure the market can do whatever it is they're doing on implementation, but still determine things like stable process management, having a clear path to remediation, and understanding what's a quality program, or indeed what is a quality SBOM.
Nice. Should we have a crack at Nitu's question? So she asks, I wonder if this could be integrated into the Ortelius project's dashboard, which is another open source project under CDF by the Linux Foundation focused on securing software supply chain too. Any ideas what that is? I've never heard of it myself, but
I have not come across that dashboard before, but I imagine the answer is probably that because we're looking at high-level, I'm just typing in the stuff here to find the dashboard. Because we're looking at a high-level process management standard here, the fundamental approach of OpenChain is we're defining a program related to license compliance, which will be part of a legal entity. And the entity will scope the program. They might cover one product, one team. They might cover one division, or they might go whole entity conformant. Regardless of their choice, the scoping is program internal to the company. And for this reason, it's a little bit different to managing software itself, per se. It's about setting in place a framework for then doing implementation details. So this might be a little different, but I'd have to read about this dashboard to be able to answer that comprehensively.
Hi Nitu. We were just talking about your question actually.
Ortelius, yeah, sorry, I had to jump. There's a fire. So I think this is where OpenChain and Ortelius, this is just an idea. We'll have to talk, and I'm happy to connect Tracy and OpenChain. Tracy Reagan runs the Ortelius project. It's also under Linux Foundation with the Continuous Delivery Foundation. And what they are trying to do is basically collect all this disparate information that is there, vulnerability databases, lot of into some kind of a dashboard. They started with the API microservices dashboard, but they have evolved since then. I used to volunteer for them prior, 2-3 years back. So I am not very close to how they have evolved, but ultimately they are very much focused towards securing the software supply chain. And I think, Shane, that as you were mentioning, there's a lot of education and compliance standards and all. I was wondering if we could leverage this dashboard to make that education more consumable.
In our case, they look like they're a lot more on the implementation level. So they're focused on looking at the software. And we're way up at the level of defining how a business process is put in place inside a company to run a program. So we're not at the implementation level. This would be something where you might use an OpenChain ISO standard for security to say, yes, we do check has inbound software a known vulnerability. And then the implementation might be using something like a dashboard such as this. So they're on the level below on the implementation side, which is slightly different to where we are. So one mental model for the OpenChain standards is to think ISO 9001, quality standard. We're somewhat similar for open source license compliance or open source security. We're setting the tone for is your approach in the right direction. But we don't do the implementation level stuff. Now, we do have a lot of reference material, though, which can show you reference training slides or reference policies or reference compliance checklists. But we're very cautious not to suggest that any of our reference material is intended to be prescriptive or canonical. So this makes us slightly different. And the reason is simply because we are making ISO standards. So we have to be very cautious in the layer we play with. Some ISO standards would be focused on an implementation detail. Let's say a document format, or an implementation detail like defining what an SBOM is. But some other standards are focused on much higher level context setting and strategy. What you don't want to do is to start covering all the layers with one standard or one set of standards, because then you're beginning to lock people into singular approaches. So in this sense, we're very cautiously way up here, and we don't meddle below except with reference material. And that's a very conscious choice. Not to say that we can't work with the people on this dashboard, we can't work with their material and include references to it. Of course we can. And we can certainly learn from them how to make our reference library more approachable. But we are working in slightly different domains. And just like with SBOM formats, we're extremely cautious not to pick sides, because we want to make sure that we're not normative for the market. We can say, here's 30 years of experience to define what a quality program's process inflection points are, but we don't want to say what you have to put in for each implementation detail, because that will be a bridge too far for the type of ISO standard we are.
So is the implementation details, is that included in the SALSA space? Like, how does SALSA fit in with all this? So there would be OpenChain and then SALSA, and then more specifically, it would be the, I actually forgot the name of it, Ortelius?
Yep.
Okay.
And one way to look at it is it's like a pyramid. So OpenChain is really at the context setting, the very basic things of I check inbound for known vulnerabilities, or I check inbound for the licensing obligations. And then we stop. And that's where you start stacking standards. So you'd see us at the top of the pyramid, set the context of the very basics, and then you kind of go with the fidelity. So let's say you start with OpenChain, then you have your SBOM choice, then you start to have other details of how you manage the SBOMs, and then below that you have the specific tools and so on. And the idea there is that you stack your standards and then you stack other things like tooling to get the whole solution. And this modular approach is necessary for cross-industry solution. So for example, in an early version of our license compliance standard, one of our requirements worked fine for the initial stakeholder group. But then someone from another industry came in and said, I literally can't meet that requirement. And it's not because I'm not doing what that requirement is intended to do. It's just that we do it differently in this industry vertical. You're too close to prescriptive. And we had to do this to ensure that we had to become split into our high level and then reference material as much as possible to ensure that the different industries would be able to operate in the way they need to, and wouldn't be trapped by a prescriptive approach. I hope that makes sense, but yeah, pyramid is a good analogy for it, and we're the starting point. And if something is missing that we cover, and if you notice, oh, I don't do that, then you can think, well, hundreds of companies said that they needed this on the supply chain. I'd better check this process inflection point out as well. But quite frankly, most of the companies in FINOS probably do what we've identified in open source license compliance and security already. It's just so happens that we have formalized this type of institutional knowledge into ISO standards, and they're easily deployable in the supply chain to suppliers, to other legal entities in the corporation and different teams. I noticed Andrew had his hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to concur with what you said there, Shane. I mean, as a consultant, so clearly, I'm doing a lot of work involving OpenChain. I'm helping organizations implement OpenChain compliant processes and so on. But then, of course, then we're asked to go into the implementation level, and I'm very sort of clear to be sure there is a difference between the OpenChain specification and the way that is implemented. But then we do find that there is a commonality, even if people are doing things in significantly different ways. So, for example, if you're generating an SBOM, there's any number of different ways you can do that. I mean, in theory, you can generate an SBOM, using an Excel spreadsheet, but that's very rarely done nowadays for obvious reasons. But there's any number of different sorts of toolings that you can use to generate the SBOM, and as we've already said, the SBOM can be in a number of different formats as well. But we've got clients who are asking us to say, okay, well, now we've got this process in place. How do we make sure that the process is continuously improved? And that's where we come on to the maturity model that we're working on, which is not necessarily itself technology specific. But what it's saying is that in practice, you're going to have some automated tooling, because only by having that automated tooling are you going to be able to get the KPIs and to be able to implement continuous improvement based on those KPIs, and that is where it's really interesting hearing you sort of talking about the dashboard, because that's when the dashboard becomes relevant. And obviously everyone's dashboard looks different, but we're really interested in getting that information at the implementation level, and then making that available, always with the goal to continuous improvement. And of course, some organizations want to focus on some areas, some organizations want to focus on others. So what you showed us was really interesting.
I'll share with you one of my experience with a previous employer. So there I was basically trying to help. So there, as sort of the lead product manager for this, and what I'm trying to do is understand what standards the company should be following, and help. There were some processes defined before I came in, right? And that's what legal and security and others were following. And at that point, and this was like 7, 8 years back, at that point, the processes were not sustainable. So they were meeting the standards and the policies and the guidelines or whatever was there, but the way they were set up, they were not sustainable. So as the open source growth increases, as the consumption of open source, our legal teams were getting overwhelmed, right? And that creates an impression of concerns about open source growth, right? It's a liability. So what we started looking into is like, okay, let's understand what are the policies, what do we have to meet, how do we have to, because we leave it to the legals to figure out legal, aspects of compliance, licenses and all that. How can we sort of codify that knowledge? We all have heard policy as code. This is like, how do we codify these standards, right? And then bring it into a tool so that even if the usage increases, we can track and evidence that we are meeting the policies, we are meeting the standards, or are we doing excellent, or some kind of a benchmarking in terms of license compliance. And security is probably better because security has vulnerability database and integrations and all that. So this is where, again, I don't have a good understanding of either the current state of Ortelius or OpenChain, but this is where I was thinking, as you mentioned, Shane, this is a pyramid, right? You start with what are the standards, and then in DevSecOps manner, you have to somehow meet it on what is the reality, right? Yep. Because we can educate, and this is the reality. And that sort of comes together. The bottom of the pyramid and the top of the pyramid comes in the middle with DevSecOps together, with these kind of dashboards or discoveries, which put together and for a layman who's not an expert in this field, for a layman, okay, we are consuming open source. How well are we doing on security? How, where are we vulnerable? Where are we, whatever ways we are doing these bombs, on sort of like in the spirit of readiness or maturity model, where are we, right? How ready or equipped are we? So these were just my thoughts.
No, it's really good thoughts. I mean, one of the most terrifying things for me in the world is when people are sitting down in a room and saying, we're going to do compliance, grab a whiteboard, and everyone starts doing tactical details, and there's no strategy. And that's a train wreck waiting to happen. It's not sustainable, and it's not accountable, it's not auditable. So the OpenChain standards are designed to go in the opposite direction. They set the strategic context, and then you build down. And the standards require every 18 months you take a breath and double check. They're not able to solve everything. They're not a panacea. They're not going to be enough. They're going to set you on the right framework. And our reference material, the other projects, they fill it out as you get the other standards and solutions in place. Now, I personally am tremendously excited about what Andrew cited, which is our standards set the context, but then how do you iterate? And the maturity modeling on this is very exciting. And particularly, several different companies have started maturity modeling based on our ISO standards. But Orcro, Andrew's organization, is contributing a maturity model to our education material, which will, I think, significantly help the market, where people can begin to get maturity modeling off our GitHub and think, okay, I've got the framework, I'm filling out with all these implementation details, but how do I iterate? How do I do those KPIs on, did I do something better, or did I just spin my wheels? So yeah, we're putting this picture together. The ISO standards will not go into implementation details, but the supporting material increasingly provides a path from day one to 10 years down the line. I still am doing good, I'm in a linear fashion, and it's sustainable.
Makes sense. Yep.
Oh yeah, Jacob's on the line. Jacob contributed a ton to our org as well. Hey, Jacob.
Hi, how are you?
I've got one more quick question. Actually, I don't know if we've got time for this, Shane, but I'm going to just jump into this anyway. So obviously you're talking about maturity modeling there. What about like conformance? Do you have any kind of like conformance testing, and do you have like badging?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The answer is we have self-certification on our website, but we purposefully are not a conformance org. We build the standard, and it would be kind of like teacher grading teacher if we were building the standard and conforming people to it. So we leave our ecosystem do that. And beyond our official partners, every company in the world that can certify you on an ISO standard can certify you on our standards. So we don't control certification on these ISO standards purposefully, but we do provide everything you need to self-certify, and we do connect you with official partners who know us well. So if you want to go down these routes, particularly in something like banking, you probably want third-party certification. Yeah, absolutely. PwC, Deloitte, TUV-SUD, TUV-Nord, Buno Veritas, they're all official certifiers in the OpenChain ecosystem, and they can help you out.
Have you seen much uptake of that so far?
I only find out what people tell me. So because it's an ISO standard, so no one is under any obligation to tell us what they've done. Have we seen uptake? Yes. Reports from people like PwC indicate significant uptake through their channels. Have we seen a ton of companies come to us and say, we're conformant? We've seen a bunch. Well over 100 have come to us and say, put our logo on your website, please. We're conformant and we want to show our supply chain. But these are genuinely open standards. We do not control how the market uses them. And for obvious antitrust reasons, we can't go around asking people, what do you ask your suppliers to do? We can't do that. But yeah, market penetration appears to be quite significant. Data is quite high. And we do know that the third-party certifiers, particularly in areas like Germany and in China, are quite busy.
All right, well, we're pretty much at time now, so I think we'll have to leave any more questions for the mailing list or something like that. But Shane, this has been super interesting, and I'm hoping that this is opening the door to more people in banking
Absolutely.
getting on board.
Hey, Rob, thank you for the opportunity, and thanks to everyone on the call. And, you know, I really appreciated the questions. It was great to be here.
Okay. Well, we'll have a video out of this in a few weeks' time. But
Perfect.
thanks, everyone. For
Take care.
and,
Thank you. It's very useful.
Bye-bye.